Okay. So let's move on to talk about the different minority groups that exist in the United States. Um, African American, Latino, Asian American, Native Americans, and even white ethnics are some of the largest minority groups that exist within our country. So we're going to begin to break this down a little bit more so that you have a better understanding of each of these individual groups. Um, each minority group has a social and economic cost of discrimination that have occurred over the course of time, which have been enormous. And each one have had their own unique experiences as minorities. So we're going to begin to dissect this a little bit more with each particular group. Figure 9.4 breaks down the race and ethnicity of the U.S. population. We can see that about 63% are white, and then it sort of goes down from that particular circle. We begin to see that African Americans fall into 13%, Latinos 16%, Asian Americans 5%, Native Americans 1%, and then we have a small portion within our U.S. population that claim multiple races. Again, a figure 9.5 gives a further breakdown of different racial and ethnic groups. So here you're starting to see a much larger breakdown scale of it. And my question is to you, do you know what your racial and ethnic background is? Do you know where your family has come from? Is there certain racial groups or ethnic groups that you identify with? Are there multiple? So that's always a really interesting graph to begin to look at some things because some individuals don't always know. Figure 9.6 talks about the distribution of dominant and minority groups. You can start to see the percentage of minorities within these particular areas. Some of the lowest percentage of minority groups exist within Maine, Vermont, and one of which is the highest is West Virginia. The highest percentage of minority groups, here we're seeing Hawaii, we're seeing California, and New Mexico. And there are definitely reasons as to why those particular areas are when you begin to break down those particular cultures and areas and sort of the immigration patterns that have occurred. All right, so let's start at European Americans. This is sort of an interesting topic. White ethnics are the descendants of immigrants from Eastern and Southern European nations, particularly Italy and Poland. So this may also include Greek, Irish, Slavic peoples. The majority are blue-collar workers, sort of living in smaller communities. In the 1960s, white ethnics had gained the underserved reputation of being conservative, racist, pro-war, hard hats. White ethnics were to be more against the Vietnam War than Anglo-Saxon Protestants during the 60s. They were more likely to favor a guaranteed annual wage, more likely to vote for African-American presidential candidates, and more concerned about the environment. So white ethnics tended to be more sympathetic to government help for the poor and more in favor of integration. What we've seen, though, over the course of time is that white ethnics have not traditionally been the victims of occupational discrimination or income discrimination. Despite their relative success, many white ethnics have in recent years become very conscious of their cultural and national origins. There are, in fact, a white ethnic roots movement that has occurred, and that's a trend fairly new toward white ethnic identity. It began with the Black Power movement of the 60s, and just like how many African Americans decided they wanted to preserve their cultural and racial identities, many white ethnics now believe that white ethnicity is beautiful. So many people think that price of completely abandoning one's particular culture or national roots is really too high for us to ignore. And so you're going to start to see that continuing focus on white ethnicity to the rising demands of ethnic minorities. So white ethnics believe that they are establishing a public identity that enables them to take a seat at the multicultural table. So again, you're looking at individuals from Italy, Poland, Ireland, that type of thing. If you look in your book, and I want to make sure that I'm giving you the correct page because your book might be slightly different than mine, you'll start to see that the white ethnic is sort of an interesting topic because it's not something we've typically looked at. Again, a lot of these immigrants are from Europe, so they have their own language and customs sort of derive from it. You know, back in the day, the English despised the Irish. They used to think of them as being dirty and lazy and drunkards. So it's sort of interesting when we look now that it's not necessarily something that can be considered discrimination pieces of it. But if you look historically, when the Irish immigrated here, you saw that there was so much racial tensions as a result of that, because of the fact that they were concerned that they were coming to take some of the resources in that. And so that's a topic all within itself that we could dive much more into. I do want to talk about the WASPs. The WASP placed an intense pressure on immigrants to assimilate into the mainstream culture. So what is the WASP? During founding times, the United States referred to this as the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They held very deep-rooted prejudice against other whites. And so there was practically no end to those stereotypes that began to emerge for these immigrants that were coming from Europe. And so the English thought of them as these very harsh brush strokes of individuals in which they said they didn't like them. They didn't want them necessarily in the country at that time frame. And so so that you have that little bit of a background, the WASPs are an important concept to sort of know because of those deeply rooted prejudice that occurred. A lot of the Protestant English immigrants definitely settled in certain colonies. You can start to see that in parts of New York, pockets of New Jersey, those types of things. So you can begin to see that there are dominant languages and particular dominant religions in certain areas, Little Italy, that type of thing. So we know that their institutions and cultural dominances are very important to the current racial and ethnic dynamics and landscape that exists within our country. All right, let's talk about Latinos. I think this is a term that people are always a little confused about if we're not very knowledgeable within that. I think people get the concept of Latinos and Hispanics a little bit confused here. Latino is an umbrella term that sort of lumps people from many cultures into a particular group. So here we're looking at minorities from Latin America, right? So this can include Mexico, Central America, South America, and even the islands of the Caribbean. There are high birth rates and immigration rates among Latinos. They are one of the fastest growing minorities in the United States. So when you look at that geographical breakdown in figure 9.7, we can see how in the early 21st century, Latinos overtook African Americans as one of America's largest minority groups that existed. So by the time you're nearing retirement, maybe about the year 2050, it's predicted that nearly 1 out of every 4 Americans will be Latino. So why are they so large? Nearly 67% of Latinos today are Mexican descent, right? So Puerto Ricans make up a little less than 9%. We begin to see that, and Puerto Ricans are actually very much concentrated in or around areas of New York City, although they are shifting to some of those outlying areas. We can also see Cubans make up a third of the populous group of Latinos with nearly 1.4 million. We begin to see Cuban Americans a lot of times in Miami, Florida area. Latinos are very diverse. So each group sort of comes to the United States under different circumstances. And of course, they attempt to retain that sense of their own identity and separateness in that sense. So there are significant internal differences within individual Latino minorities. So think about the large group of Cuban immigrants, right? Many were very successful middle and upper class people who fled from Cuba during the Fidel Castro period, during that communist government in the late 1950s. So Cuban Americans differ substantially from later Cuban immigrants who were relatively uneducated members of a lower class. I think what we tend to do in our society is just sort of lump Latinos in this one group, but what I think we need to know is that there are vast differences within this particular group. And you can start to see that here. That there are, of course, some topics that I'm going to sort of breeze over because you guys can read about that in the book as far as unauthorized immigrants. And again, these are topics that are highly controversial. If any of you are looking at current topic choices for your bonus, this is one in which you guys could do a little bit more research on. There are, of course, a lot of controversy now with the border wall that's being Trump's trying to implement. That is one in which you guys could talk about within your bonus opportunity if you wanted to. And the question begs to answer, most Latinos are U.S. citizens and have entered the country perhaps legally, but there are a portion of which that have come in illegally. And so the controversy has begun to arise as that temporary work, as well as unauthorized immigrants. And so this is a topic that has really become highly politicized because of the Immigration Reform and Control Act that occurred. And so you guys can read about that a little bit more. You can talk about illegal crossings and the border patrols, and of course current state and national legislation that's sort of gone to look into this a little bit more. What you're going to start to see is that 7 out of every 10 Latinos live in just about 6 states, which is interesting. You're going to find that California, Texas, Florida, even New York and Illinois and Arizona are the main premise of that. We, of course, see a large Latino presence in the Miami area, which is basically called, in a sense, the capital of South America. One of the factors that I think we should sort of distinguish as Latinos from other U.S. minorities is the Spanish language. Not all Latinos speak Spanish, okay? A good proportion do. But I think that that's one of those stereotypes that we believe that all Latinos speak Spanish. That's not. Many cannot speak English, and if they do, some of them can have some difficulty with that language. We know that about 37 million Latinos speak Spanish at home. And so being fluent in Spanish in a society that prioritizes English can be a barrier to some of these individuals. And so that's sort of important for us to look at here. And hence why Spanish is one of the main core second languages that's taught within high schools, right? Let's talk about the economic well-being. We know an average income for Latinos is around $34,241. It's higher than that of African Americans. I'm sorry, I'm missing some slides that you guys should be seeing while I'm doing this here. So, but significantly lower than that of non-Latino whites, which is about $48,977, roughly. Okay, Cubans are the most affluent Latinos. Their median income is roughly about 75% that of whites. The poorest among the large Latino groups tends to be Puerto Ricans. And almost 22% of Latino families live below the poverty level, compared with slightly less than 9% of white non-Latinos. So when we look at this data, you can see that many Latinos work in low-paying and low-status jobs, many of which are semi-skilled workers and unskilled laborers. Mexican Americans make up the majority of migrant workers in our country. So Cuban men belong to only the Latino minority with occupations similar to that of the white Anglo majority. So the numbers of Latino-owned homes and businesses are increasing rapidly, though, and I think that that's really important, but they still are far behind the national averages when we look at that. And not only that, but if we were to also look at the education component of it, you can see Latinos fall behind white Americans in formal education. Just about 57% of adult Latinos have completed high school, compared with about 85% of non-Latinos. Mexican Americans have some of the lowest levels of educational attainment. Cubans have some of the highest, owing to the fact that many Cuban immigrants in the United States were middle and upper class people, which we had talked about before. So I think that's really important when we begin to break down not only the racial and ethnic component of it, but also the social class component of it too. All right. So let's continue to move on. Let's talk about African Americans. They make up the largest racial minority group in the United States. We have probably over 37 million, or about 13% of the total population here. They are also one of the oldest minorities. They were first brought to the America as indentured servants and slaves in the early 1600s. There are many reasons that there's a lack of acceptance of African Americans in the mainstream of U.S. society. And this goes back historically to the controversy of the skin color and physical features that make it possible to identify African Americans' lineage. So when we're looking at this, it's easy for the dominant white ethnic group to create those negative stereotypes based on physical characteristics. A second reason that continuing minority status of African Americans has its roots in early American history, right? Think about that. Brought into the country to labor on plantations, African Americans were immediately assigned to lower class statuses. Even when freed, we had a lot of ex-slaves and their descendants in the U.S. that were rarely accepted as equal to that of the free whites, right? So we begin to see upward social mobility for freed slaves was virtually impossible at times. And so slavery was legally abolished by the 13th Amendment. And you guys probably talked about this in history class. But that legacy of prejudice and discrimination really grew out of the slavery effects that happened to African Americans early on in history. So those practices and laws that segregated the races became sort of institutionalized, especially in the South. The races became highly institutionalized. And so we began to see some of those practices continued until the late 1960s, when the civil rights legislation and key Supreme Court decisions began to occur. So this is very real in the sense that African Americans have experienced 40 years of constitutional equality, right? There is a huge gap that African Americans and whites have occurred in education, income, employment, because of those centuries of prejudice and discrimination. And again, you probably have talked about the Jim Crow laws, and a lot of the stuff there. That image right there is one in which occurred down in Jackson, Mississippi, where the heads of these individuals were had mustard and ketchup and condiments and drinks poured on top of them. And some of these individuals were white, some were of African American descent. You can see that they were attempting to protest the segregation that was occurring in the South. And so this was very much a system that was broken in a sense. We began, I think, to see after a lot of the civil rights acts that had occurred, I think that African Americans were experiencing something that sociologists called the rising expectation, right? It's this sense that there are going to be better conditions that are soon to follow. And a lot of times what we saw was that that wasn't the case. And so that frustration began to build and build. You began to see people living in ghettos in Los Angeles. There was a lot of revolts, urban revolts. Even we began to see that white supremacy groups began to continue to occur even into the late 60s and stuff. I don't know if I had talked to you guys about this before, but I think people think that white supremacy groups have sort of disappeared. They have not. I have a colleague in the field. He worked closely with the FBI. He had indicated that we have some of the largest white supremacy, there are concerns, I guess I should say, of white supremacy groups nestled in certain parts that are very close to us as a result. I don't know if you guys remember some of the controversy that had occurred with some of the bird seeds, things being shuffled onto people's doorsteps as a result of that. That was pretty recent. That was maybe, a year or so ago, a couple years ago, right? So it's still very much occurring within our society, is basically what I'm trying to get There are race and ethnicity extremes that are occurring here. Average African American income in the U.S. is far from equal to the average income for whites. We can begin to see that there's some vast differences here when you look at the difference in wealth and home and car and business assets and even other household generated income. Okay. So, again, continued issues here. One of which I do want to say is that, there have been some huge movements as well as making some advancements. Despite anybody's political beliefs, keeping all that aside, we know that there have been some movements as far as higher educational attainment for African Americans. We know that there are still huge disparities that are occurring. Black men tend to gain less than their white peers. We also know that there are some advances. The United States Senator Barack Obama of Illinois had gained presidency. So that's another topic that if somebody wants to look at race a little bit more, that's another topic and a current event that you could talk about. African Americans have, of course, increased their political presence. And so we began to see that about 43 African Americans now serve in Congress. So I think that's important for us to look at too.